right, hello guys, Mrs. Summers here. There we go. I'm gonna start presenting here. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at tissue. So we're going to start our unit off and do an introduction and then also look at different types of epithelial tissue. So if you don't have the student note sheet open yet, go ahead and find that. Right, so it should say intro and epithelial tissue. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. All right, so thinking back to the levels of organization, right? So if we start with like thinking of cells, and then similar cells are going to start to form tissues, right? So that similar cells group together that perform a specialized function. Okay, so today we're going to get into what are the main types of tissues, and then specifically look at epithelial tissue. All right, so on your note sheet, there should be a spot to write this down, right? So we have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Okay, so there's 4 main types of tissue. In this unit, we're specifically going to get into epithelial and connective, and then we'll talk a little bit more about muscle tissue and nervous tissue when we cover the nervous system and our muscular system units. Right, so we're really going to focus on epithelial and connective right now. All right, so some characteristics when we're looking at epithelial tissue. Okay, and you can go ahead and write these down on your note sheet as well. Epithelial tissue is going to cover our organs and line body surfaces. Okay, so like if you think of your epidermis, right, this is all epithelial tissue. Epi, the prefix means above or upon. So that's something that we'll start talking a little bit more about prefixes and root words and suffixes, because the more like medical terminology we know, the easier it is for us to predict the meanings of words. Okay, so epithelial tissue, there's always a free surface, and that's known as the apical surface. Okay, and then the other surface, right on the other side, is going to be anchored to a basement membrane, and that membrane is non-living. Okay, a couple more characteristics of epithelial tissue is that it lacks blood vessels, so it lacks blood supply, right? So if we think about our skin, if this is epithelial tissue, right, we don't want that blood supply to be like all the way on the outside, otherwise that could cause damage and bleeding, and that would not be good. But, right, some positives, if we keep thinking about epithelial tissue in terms of like being our skin, right, so there's a lot of wear and tear that happens, and when it's like constantly in contact with things, right, so we need it to be able to heal quickly. So a characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it divides rapidly, right, so thinking about healing and mitosis, and it's also tightly packed. Right, so that allows kind of another support or protection as well. Okay, there's 3 main functions of epithelial tissue. They provide protection, absorption, and secretion as well. All right, so really quickly looking at a basic structure of epithelial tissue, right? So we have the apical, or like the free surface. Okay, and then we have the basement membrane down at the bottom. So that's the one that is attached to connective tissue that's underneath. Okay, and that's kind of what I just said with connective tissue, right? And then we should be able to see the nucleus or the nuclei within each cell. Okay, and then on some, we'll see the microvilli or the cilia, we'll usually call it. Okay, and then depending on the type of epithelial tissue, there could be goblet cells. Goblet cells are going to produce mucus, right? So if we think of like the lining of our stomach, those are there's all sorts of different cells in there that produce mucus, okay, and then absorptive cells as well. So that allows nutrients to diffuse into cells. All right, so epithelial tissue is categorized by the shape of the cell and also the number of layers. Okay, so that's going to be really helpful to help you remember the different types of epithelial tissue. Okay, so if we start squamous or squamous, so you'll hear it be pronounced either way, right? That means flat. Okay, so we're looking for that flat layer, almost like it sounds like it's squashed. Squamous, squamous, squashed. Okay, cuboidal, just like it sounds. Those cells are going to be more cube-like. Okay, so very square-like. Columnar, right? If we think about, well, what does that sound like? Okay, that sounds like a column, right? Columns are going to be more rectangular, longer than they are wide. Okay, and then moving on to the layers, there's simple. That just means we have one single simple layer, and then stratified. That means that we have multiple layers. Okay, so if you look at the picture over here, right, we combine those two words. Okay, so the number of layers and then the shape. So we can have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. So that's just telling us simple, we have that one layer. Squamous, right, that means flat. Simple cuboidal, so it's going to be the one layer of the cube-shaped cells, and then simple columnar, one layer, and now we're looking at, right, the longer column-like cells. Okay, and then stratified just means that it's layered. All right, so let's get into some more specifics here. All right, so the first type is simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so simple squamous, right? What does that mean? Simple means one layer, squamous means the flat. So it's a single layer of flat cells. And then we also want to think about, well, why is that important? So the structure will then lead to the function. So we want to keep that in mind kind of when we're learning about tissue, right? And the reason we need certain places in our body to have just that one single thin layer of cells is so that substances can pass through. Okay, so for all of these, we're going to go over what is the type of tissue, how can you identify it in a picture, the function or the features, and where in the body is that located. Okay, so you'll want to be able to know those things. The type of tissue, can you identify a picture of it? What are its functions, and where in the body is it located? And usually those kind of go hand in hand, right? So if we think about where in our body do we want these really thin layers or I should say layer of cells, right? Well, if we think about the alveoli, right, those are the tiny air sacs in our lungs. So if we just have one single layer, right, then substances can pass through. So in the alveoli, carbon dioxide and oxygen can pass through, and then capillaries as well, right? So if we think about like nutrients being able to get through, or hormones, right, so that simple squamous epithelium allows that. Okay, another kind, or the next kind, is simple cuboidal, right? So simple means one layer. Cuboidal is referring to that cube shape. Okay, so if we look at the picture here, and kind of looking at the function or the feature as well, right? So that it allows for secretion and absorption. But if we think about the kidney tubules, right? So then look at the picture. If we kind of imagine a tube or like a straw, right? And we cut through it, right? So the picture there is showing us basically like a lot of tubules, right, that are kind of cut on that cross section. Okay, so simple cuboidal, the thing to know about that is they make up our kidney tubules and allow for secretion and absorption. Okay, and then the next one is simple columnar. Simple referring to one layer, columnar more column shaped, right, so longer than they are wide. They're going to secrete enzymes and mucus as well as absorb nutrients. Some of them have cilia, but some of them it's not really clear to see. And the most common location that we'll find simple columnar cells are lining our stomach and also in the fallopian tubes as well. All right, pseudostratified. This is kind of a more unique type of epithelium tissue or epithelial tissue. If we think about the root word there, right, pseudo, if anyone knows what pseudo means, like a pseudopod, pseudopod means false feet, so pseudo means false. So this is saying that it's false stratified, so false layered columnar. Okay, so it appears to be stratified, but it is not. So what we want to look for there is the nuclei are going to be in like different locations, but if we look at like each cell, the basement layer should all be at the same, they all attach to the same basement membrane. That basement layer should all be the same. Something really common to look for with pseudostratified is to look for the long cilia at the top, and it lines our respiratory passages, right? So if we think about, right, lining of our nose, down our trachea, right? So that's where we're going to find pseudostratified, so false layered. Okay, and then moving on to stratified squamous. Right, stratified means many layers. Squamous is referring to it's flat, right? So if we think of our skin here, stratified squamous skin. Okay, so that's going to make up kind of the most common example of stratified squamous is going to be our skin. And then we'll also see it, right, in the oral cavity, right? The esophagus, the vagina, and the anal canal as well. Okay, these are two types of more rare epithelial tissue, so you will not be expected to be able to identify these, but just know that they're out there and they exist, right? So we have stratified cuboidal, so that means layers of the cube cells. So we can find those in sweat glands and salivary glands, right? And then we have stratified columnar, so that's layers or like multiple layers of the columnar. And we can find that in the male urethra and also in the pharynx. So they're in very specific places in the body. And again, just know that they exist, but you won't be expected to know them. And then the last one, this one is kind of a unique one as well, is transitional epithelium. So you might be looking at that picture like, wait a minute, it's not talking about simple or stratified, there's no shape, right? So transitional cells, usually I look for like a cluster of cells, because the biggest thing with transitional epithelium is that it can stretch and contract, right? So, well, what organ, where in our body would we want that to happen? Specifically in the bladder, right? The urinary bladder, right? So as your kidneys are working, right? So if this is your pretend bladder, as our kidneys are working, right, and they're filtering our blood and forming urine, right? That urine is going to then be stored in the bladder, right? So that transitional epithelium, right, allows for that changing in shape, right? And then when you go to the bathroom, right, it's going to be able to kind of relax again as well. All right, so that's a quick overview of epithelial tissue, right? So again, to kind of keep in mind, right, what do you need to know, right? You want to know the type of tissue. Can you identify a picture of it? What are its functions or features? And where in the body is it located? All right. And that is it for the notes today. If I can figure out how to turn it off. All right, bye guys.